Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. Now what I've got whizzing around in front of me today is actually an answer to a question. Now I don't always answer questions immediately like I have with this guy, but I just happened to have the perfect miniature, and it was somebody asking if it was possible to paint Guardsmen, specifically Catachans or Space Nam stuff from Reptilian Overlords, a little bit more quickly. How do you do stuff that doesn't feature camo? Well, what I like to turn to is the 3-color method. Now this I'll explain as we go. It is super simple. All of the paints for this one will be listed in the description below, so let's get started. Okay, so the crux of this method in painting really very quickly is in having 3 main colors that you've got in mind for your miniature from the outset. So in most miniatures, particularly your Imperial Guard, whether they be Cadian styled, Catachan, what have you, you're looking at the uniform, the webbing and equipment, and any armor. That's it. That's the 3 colors you need to bear in mind. The rest you're just going to paint skin and black and metal, and that's it. So this fella here, I've started with a primer of Death Guard green because I want a green look to him. So I need to pick my webbing and equipment color and then my armor color. 9 times out of 10, you're going to find it easiest to start from the lightest color being the uniform because it gives it a nice faded finish. Then a medium color for the webbing and equipment, and I'm going to use Russian Uniform World War II for this. And then the armor, the darkest color that you've got, and I'm going to use Camo Olive Green. Now why Vallejo in this instance? Well, these tend to cover just a little bit better than you'll see from the Citadel range. Now the base colors are very nice, most of them cover quite well, but they have a kind of satin-ish finish to them, and it will ordinarily require 2 or 3 coats being applied so that you get a solid finish. If you want speed, go for the right tool for the job. I'm not worried about a really lustrous finish. I'm going to matte varnish this dude anyway, so Vallejo, which tends to dry just a little bit more flat and drab, is going to be perfect. So starting with that Russian uniform, I'm going to apply this to all of his webbing. Now try not to get too hung up on the precise colors here. This could just as easily be, say, Deathworld Forest and then, what is it, Dark Angels Green? No, Caliban Green. The real crux of it here is that you want to pick a color that covers extremely well and follow that light, medium, dark for the color scheme. I've actually used this a couple of times on the channel already, a very similar method. If you check out a couple of the Majestic 13 teams that I've painted, they are done in a similar method but using grays, and that's why this is so easy to adapt. Now, I am going to swap to a larger brush actually to do the backpack, but the rest of this, let's just scoot round quick as we can. Anything that's going to be soft, so as gaiters as well, we will all be in that medium green. Now, full disclosure, when it came to his pack, the big smooth areas of the back, I did need to come back and give them a second coat, but they were still quicker than laying it down with something else. What I'm going to go to now is Bugman's Glow, and I'm going to base coat his skin. Now, to be quite honest, the order in which you do this is going to depend a little bit on what you are painting. Ordinarily, I wouldn't necessarily do this stage now with a Cadian looking miniature, but I think it will help me demonstrate a point. Say you're doing something like Catachans or similar, then when you do the skin first, you can be a little bit more messy as you apply or tidy up for your armor. So Bugman's Glow on the skin, and then we're going to make a dreadful mess of it. And when I say we're going to make a mess, I mean it. What I've got is a battered old brush, something nice and soft. I'd also recommend you can use a makeup brush like I normally do for these. And I had some Nurgling Green. Now, what I'm going to use this for is to lightly dry brush along both the edges of the uniform and the webbing colors that we've used. So you want to pick something which is going to work for both of these. Now this will depend, of course, on what you're painting. But yeah, just a little bit of highlighting here is going to serve us dividends in the long run. And now, if you do end up going over the hands, the face or what have you, don't worry too much. We can tidy that up as our next step. Now that will be more prominent on your webbing than your uniform, but that is fine. Let's just blast back over with that Bugman's Glow just to get rid of the green. Now, come to think of it, you might even be able to skip that step. Being as we're going to highlight that skin later, you'll probably end up covering that with your next highlight color, but I like to be thorough. If you do decide to skip it sometime, let me know how it turns out. I'm using now the camo olive green, and I'm going to paint over the armor. And you'll see what I mean about this just covering. Oh, so nice. Now, in previous examples, I have painted the weapon casings in a different green, just for a little bit of visual interest. But if you are looking for speed, don't bother. Just jam it all on the same green. It's not going to matter. Now, I know I did mention using 3 colors, but it's also got this funky little bedroll, and I like to stick to the green sort of style. So I'm using Ironrach Skin, or Ionrach. I can never tell how I'm supposed to pronounce this one, but it doesn't matter. So on it goes. Now, the last handful of base coats I am going to do very quickly off screen. You've seen 300 videos where I've done black and metal. I will list the colors in the description. They've got their own little section where it says painted off screen, along with what they were applied to. So you're not going to be missing out if you're really wondering how I painted the handle on the entrenching tool. But let's give that the old movie magic. And with those last base coats applied, any last minute tidy up, you can get that out of the way now, and then it's time to shade them. Now, what I'd always recommend, if you are looking for a way to skip the whole base coat layer highlight, you want to cut one of those out entirely, thin your shades. So what I've got here is Agrax Earthshade, thinned half and half with Lahmian Medium. Now, a really common question is why use Lahmian Medium instead of Contrast Medium? And the answer is quite simple. I don't want it to grip and shrink on the surface in the same way that the Contrast does. I want it to flow. I want it to really flow around like it used to before they changed the formula. So adding the medium will give me that and thin down the color a little bit so it's not so overpowering when it goes on. So we're going to shade the entire miniature. Make sure that you're getting it into all the recesses, standard stuff here. And yeah, once I'm done with this, we'll give that about half an hour to dry and see what we get. I think there are a couple of spots that aren't quite dry yet, but I think that goes to show, okay, he'll look fine. You can pop them on the table like that, but I am going to do just 2 things before I really call them finished. First of all, I do want to highlight his skin. And particularly if you're going to use this method to paint Catachans or similar, you're going to paint a lot of this, so it's worth practicing. I've got Cadian Flesh Tone, and I'm going to paint over most of the skin again, leaving just a little bit of the Bugman's Glow shaded in the recesses. The trick here, if you're struggling to keep control of paint, is have just a little bit of it on your brush at a time. Don't want to load it up with much more than a dot. Yes, you're going to have to keep going back to your little puddle, but it will let you control this much more easily. Now, if you find that a little tricky, it can be worth starting from a lighter base coat. In that case, instead of Bugman's Glow, I'd suggest picking up Tanned Flesh from the Army Painter. You may have seen me use that quite a few times before for exactly this reason. What I've got now is Kislev Flesh, and what I'm going to do is just pick out a few sharp details, like his cheekbones, his nose, his ears and what have you, just to add a little bit more depth to this face. Okay, from here I would quite happily just varnish him and put him on the table. Obviously we can highlight him, and I'm going to in a couple of seconds here, but first let's pop a really quick base on him. I'll pop the recipe for this one in the description. It's literally just going to be some textured paint and a couple of dry brushes. So there we have it, a nice simple base to add a little bit of context, and it's an interesting point where you can add a bit of color to the miniature without actually painting anything extra on there. So I've chosen these are the Highland tufts from the Army Painter, and they've got a little bit of almost reddish warmth in there, which adds quite a bit to the whole effect. And like I said, you don't have to paint anything. But from here, I still think we can take it a little bit further. I definitely call this done for the sake of your bulk infantry. You're knocking out men to put on the table. So first off, I'm going to Nurgling Green again, but this time I'm going to use the layer version. Now, I've got both the layer and the dry version. but you don't really need both. If you are looking for one or the other, grab yourself the layer version and you can dry brush with it with a little bit of care. What I'm going to do is just pick out some of the areas on the uniform, which we dry brush with Nurgling Green, and I'm now going to add a tiny wee bit more of this just to accentuate some of these folds a bit more sharply. Now you don't have to do very much of that, just enough to help define some of the edges, and I think it looks pretty cool. What I'm going to move to next is Steel. This is a Vallejo Model Air color, but it comes off a brush perfectly well. You'll see, same as with the highlighting of the skin, I've only got a tiny wee bit of this on the brush. And that's because I'm going to use this to highlight both the metalwork and the armor and any metallic black details, just by dabbing lightly some very small little chips and lines, rather than worrying about getting 3 or 4 different highlight colors for this. So this can take a bit of practice because honestly here brush control is really quite paramount. But once you've got your eye in with it and you really just got a little bit of paint at a time, you've pretty much got a universal highlight in the form of silver. The last thing I'm going to do will be to get a little bit of Carroburg Crimson, just dot that onto my palette, don't need very much at all, and thin it with a bit of fresh water. Well, I'm actually using the same grimy water that I've been painting with, but it won't matter. I'm going to pop a wee glaze of this across his bottom lip. And then what I'm going to do, once I've knocked my camera around a bit, I'll go ahead and let this dry, give him a quick matte varnish, and let's get a look at what he looks like with those last couple of details applied. And there at last, our Jungle Greens Guardsman is complete. And this same method, like I mentioned, will work for all sorts of things. I'll make sure to drop in the description a link to the Majestic 13 teams that I've painted using similar methods, and I will also include a little list of suggestions which you might find useful for painting other climates like desert styles or urban or what have you, because sticking to very simple 3-colored methods is going to work for a lot of different stuff. Remember that in reality, and I know it's a grubby word, uniforms are generally not 5 or 6 different colors. We're trying to make sure that these guys are hard to spot on the field, but as miniatures, we've got to make them look a little bit more interesting to look at. Anyhow, as always, thank you very much to Exit 23 Games for the light and sound equipment, as well as all of my wonderful patrons who are keeping me ticking in paints and glue, including my gorgeous producers showing up on screen now. Thank you very much for your support, folks. Any questions or anything, feel free to drop them in the old comment box below. You never know, I might end up answering it in the same way as I have this one. Although no promises. My Twitter and Instagram are both linked there too. So, thank you very much for your time, one and all, and you all enjoy the rest of your day.